unexplained disturbance and the hysteria that it's causing are incredible.
How would you describe what you are seeing?
It is clearing the mountains, moving too slowly to be a comet or meteor. Widespread panic has gripped the countryside as thousands have taken to the streets.
It is confirmed.
All science fiction ends with a message. And either the message is in your face, sometimes in the lens of the camera, and sometimes it's much more subtle.
I think the purpose of science fiction is not so much to predict the future, but to play what-if games and to reflect ourselves into in a kind of a funhouse mirror where we see ourselves in different ways.
Well, it's definitely something, you know, like kind of comes out of the American psyche, because it's this feeling, you know, like us against the world, you know. And I think deep down, you know, it's always like kind of, for me at least, you know, it's always this like kind of fear of the end.
The more anxious a society becomes, the more you see this sort of apocalyptic, you know, the more those demons sort of have to be exorcised.
I think the context of the time when science fiction became an American genre in the 1950s, when the Cold War really starts. I mean, it's after World War II. Science fiction sort of first emerged, you know, at this moment in American culture when all sorts of terrors were present, whether it was nuclear annihilation or this fifth column, people looking just like us, but who really wanted to take us over.
Now you go through World War II, and you're confronted with, 50 million human beings dead around the planet, a war ended by a nuclear weapon, a new idea, something that had never existed before, but just confronted with technological warfare on such a vast scale, the bombers, the ships, the submarines, all of a sudden, all of our fate as human beings, our destiny seems bound up in our technology, and our technology is frightening. It's terrifying.
The survival town Atom Test measured a model village in the Nevada dirt against the awesome power of nuclear energy. Buildings of various materials went up. $1 million worth of equipment was installed, including lifelike mannequins, and tons of food to measure the contamination caused by radiation. The big dolls were survival town's sole inhabitants.
For this could be your house and your window. 3,500 feet away, a split second later,
the Cold War was very in the media, and it was the Hiroshima and Nagasaki image was on television every other week, and the tests of blowing away the buildings and all that. So we had very clear images of what this whole thing looked like, what the consequences were, and it was over and over and over. That combined with the World War II stock footage documentaries that were on every hour, every day. They were sort of the Star Trek of their day. You couldn't go onto any channel anywhere without getting a World War II documentary about war. So war and total annihilation seemed inevitable in those days.
Operation Alert, a realistic rehearsal for an atomic attack, was the biggest nationwide air raid drill ever attempted. In Washington, 15,000 key government workers left their desks, scattering to 31 secret rural sites away from the capital.
And we were terrified of being bombed by the Soviet Union. The nuclear weapon was the thing that was making certainly me do these air raid drills in school, we all ducked and covered under our desks. I went through that. I was of that era.
That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school.
Duck and cover is hysterically funny, but if you actually learn a lot about nuclear weapons, they had done all these tests on like frying pigs out in the desert and blowing up houses that they'd built for taxpayer money, and they knew that, and they thought, you know what, these pamphlets and these stupid films and the little turtle saying duck and cover could actually mean the difference. Duck and cover. I was 8. And I was asking a lot of questions of my dad. What are these civil defense pamphlets that are sitting out on the coffee table here? What is this? What is this nuclear bomb? And I became terrified of the nuclear bomb at the age of somewhere between 8 and 10. And I've been fascinated by nuclear weaponry since. I mean, Terminator, my first true directed film, was about a nuclear war that had destroyed human civilization. And I've had that kind of nuclear theme or the menacing technology theme through pretty much all my stuff, even Titanic.
And I remember thinking that was a clear and present danger when I was a kid. I was more terrified of being nuked than my parents were. My parents couldn't imagine that an intelligent nation like Russia would ever push a button on us, nor would we on them. But as you know, we almost pushed the button on each other during the Cuban Missile Crisis. My parents went to a party the day the crisis reached that critical. I was watching television, and I had filled all the bathtubs up with water. Just every sink in one bathtub in my mom's bedroom, I filled it up with water because I figured the water's going to stop. They're going to turn the water off. This will be our drinking water. We had no hole in our backyard. We had no basement in Arizona. But I was prepared for Armageddon. I was absolutely prepared for that. And these movies in the 1950s and early 60s played on those fears. And these movies were all metaphors for those fears. All those movies with the giant tarantula, there was a giant praying mantis called the giant mantis. There was the tarantula movie. All these things becoming big all stems from the atomic bomb. And we have to give credit to the Japanese and Toho Productions for making Godzilla. Which was the first time a mutant creature, both from the prehistoric era, but revived because of the atomic devastation at Nagasaki and Hiroshima and other atomic testing going on in those days, created the cocktail that allowed this creature to come out in Tokyo Harbor and start devastating the city. And that was the very first one ever made.
I can hardly believe what has just happened. Now it seems Tokyo has no defense.
The creature is, in a sense, the bomb because of all the destruction it's creating and leveling cities. Yet at the same time, it's the bomb that ends up, blasting it to hell and back and saving the world, as it were. So in a lot of the films where you have the creatures that suddenly are, through a nuclear test, somehow able to get through the ice or are mutated in the desert. This sounds so silly, but it's really significant.
Who knows what waits for us in nature's no man's land?
Impossible, unbelievable, fantastic. But I tell you, it could happen. It could happen. It could happen. It could happen.
Yes, it could happen. For various authorities believe that buried somewhere under the polar ice cap, in a state of suspended animation, are the awesome creatures, the leviathans that roamed the earth at the dawn of time. And under certain conditions, a nuclear explosion can free one from his icy tomb. Then, guided by instinct, the beast would come back to the caverns of the deepest Atlantic, where it was spawned.
One of the interesting things about the creature films, particularly, where it's the giant Rhedosaurus awakened by a nuclear blast from the ice in the Arctic, who eventually makes its way to Coney Island in Brooklyn, or that was 20,000 fathoms. All of these creatures, whether they were octopus, a giant octopus, or the cheesiest crab monsters, which were giant Maine lobsters in a really low-budget film, they, in a way, all sort of and if anything, evoke dinosaurs, prehistoric creatures, giant, insects, whatever. They were all sort of primal.
Produced on a scale never achieved before by any science fiction picture. Thousands in the cast.
In a way, was sort of figuring on the screen the kind of anxiety about a return, the absolute destruction of civilization, and a return to the primal sink, basically.
Stay in your homes, I repeat. Stay in your homes. Your personal safety, the safety of the entire city, depends upon your full cooperation with the military authorities.
Yes, cities, nations, even civilization itself, threatened with annihilation. Because in one moment of history-making violence, nature, mad, rampant, wrought its most awesome creation. For born in that swirling inferno of radioactive dust were things so horrible, so terrifying, so hideous. There is no word to describe them.
I'll never forget Them, which starts in kind of the California desert with all those yucca cactuses, and there's a sandstorm going on. That might have influenced me a little bit to start Close Encounters with the sandstorm. And I remember that little girl they find wandering the desert, and she's just absolutely in shock, in a complete state of shock, and they try to get her to speak, and she won't. And finally, she hears that really great sound effect that the ants made. It was from a distance, that kind of chirp, that constant like that. And she just looks almost into the camera and says, "Them, them, them." Now, these films weren't movies directed by William Wyler and starring, Montgomery Clift and Marlon Brando. Oh, no, this was a trickle-down factor. This went way below the front office down to the B-movie offices, those little wooden shingled bungalows way off in the back lot somewhere, right next to probably where they made the cartoon shorts, were a lot of young kids who were able to spend $150,000 to make a 35-millimeter movie under the auspices of Allied Artists or any of the different Monogram or Universal. And there was a little department that we were able to express ourselves about the world we lived in. Because science fiction is really a mirror, geopolitically, of the world we exist in, and it's always been that.
I think America went kind of through the Cold War. There was a lot of paranoia, but even before, there was always the fear of communism and stuff. And I think the Americans, always had this chip on their shoulder that they were afraid, that the communists overrun them, and then later, the Russians will invade. And I think that fed some sort of paranoia, which is expressed a lot in movies, And I think the whole the 50s, were especially, were especially science fiction movies and horror movies, they were all fed by this fear of invasion.
Listen to me. Please listen. If you don't, if you won't, if you fail to understand, then the same incredible terror that's menacing me will strike at you!
They come from another world, spawned in the light years of space, unleashed to take over the bodies and souls of the people of our planet.
Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a response to McCarthyism. I think pretty much everybody agrees that there's this creeping dread, and/or a response to the fear of communism, which was the source of McCarthyism. The idea that you may look like me, but you're different, and you're somehow evil on the inside.
It's whatever intelligence or instinct it is that can govern the forming of human flesh and blood out of thin air is fantastically powerful, beyond any comprehension.
This isn't just an ordinary body, is it?
I never saw one like it. It looks
unused.
Manifested itself in many ways over the years, even zombie movies, I mean, you look like me, but you're not human, and a lot of alien invasion stories that are basically, the doppelganger kind of thing. But it was absolutely an expression of the time, this fear that America was being invaded by ideas that were different, and that people were being infected by these ideas, and it was shaking the very foundations of what everybody collectively thought they believed in. People feel that they're not themselves, or that they're being replaced, or that's the most terrifying thing in the world. You can fight the things that you can fight a big monster, but you can't fight the loss of yourself, and the idea that your soul will be stolen while you sleep. It's a fear of death, it's a fear of dissolution, a fear of the loss of ego, all of those things.
I guess because you lose your emotions when you fall asleep and you're invaded by your doppelganger that grows out of the alien pods. Don Siegel and his writers worked very hard to humanize these characters, the Dana Winter and Kevin McCarthy character, and their friends having little supper parties and things, to make it seem like you were their neighbors and you understood what their lifestyles were, the small town they lived in. It was very, hyper real. And I learned a big lesson from that. If you create a hyper reality, then you can do anything on the other end of the spectrum in terms of bringing the goofiest, concepts of, and then when you upset, this sort of level of, I know people like that. I've been to houses like that. I have friends who are just like them. Then it's really scary. And that's where fear comes from. Fear doesn't come from eccentric characters being invaded by the body snatchers. Fear comes from normal characters being invaded by things that are unimaginable.
Jack!
Miles, where do they come from?
I don't know. Suddenly, while you're asleep, they'll absorb your minds, your memories.
I don't want any part of it.
You're forgetting something, Miles.
What's that?
You have no choice.
Body Snatchers, very specifically, it's been interesting because it's been written about not just as a fear of communism, but also the fear of the kind of conservatism of American culture. Siegel is, clearly, on one hand, it links up politically with the the fear of communism. But on the other hand, you could read it just instead of conservatively, you could read it liberally as the fear of everybody being told to lockstep and think the same way in the U.S. So it's one of the powers of the film is whether it's recognized by an audience explicitly, is this ambiguity.
Stop and listen! Stop and listen to me! Listen!
Which is why the very end of the film ends on a paranoid note.
They're here already! You're next!
The fear of being made soulless by communism, where everybody was the same. I mean, this is the same moment when there are books coming out like The Organization Man, and a novel which was very popular, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, because in the post-World War II area, that was also the rise of suburbia and consumerism, and people riding their commuter trains dressed the same way into work. It was a very conservative era. Era has its fashions, as it were, but I remember as a kid, women, cashmere sweaters, sweater sets, felt skirts with appliques. I mean, we had more uniforms then in a certain way. So there was, for many people, a fear of just everybody becoming the same in this new, huge, booming culture where in suburbia all the houses looked alike. There used to be jokes in the New Yorker and other places about someone going into the wrong house with the wrong wife. So you put all those together and you have this sense of huge change and great threat to the individuality, threat to becoming part of a mass that you never chose to be, and certainly lurking and underneath and being over the top of nuclear annihilation.
In this system, the value of individual man diminishes sharply, and the state is all important. The state will run his life for him, his political life, his business life, his social life. What we oppose fundamentally is the aggressive nature of the communist state. Its unceasing effort to expand wherever it can, to grow bigger, to take over, to supplant. This deadly impulse toward aggression we oppose as a continual threat to peace.
So science fiction is doing something else relative to our fears of science and technology. And the military-industrial complex and the new world order of mass consumerism and a certain kind of sense of globality, which certainly is nothing like we feel today, but with the advent of television and communications explosion. So many of those films, focus on television sets and montages of things going on at the same time across the world. We get a shot of Moscow, screaming at the aliens, or, Big Ben in all these monuments, the Eiffel Tower, and so forth.
Flying saucers have invaded our planet. Washington, London, Paris, Moscow are key targets. The whole world is under attack. Can it survive?
We are the survivors of a disintegrated solar system. At this moment, the remainder of our fleet is circling your globe.
What do you want with me?
Arrange for your world leaders to confer with us in the city of Washington.
And that fear of not just the Russians and invasions, but of the world being decimated, you can see also at this time metaphorized in these films. Robert Wise's The Day the Earth Stood Still was pretty explicit about what its supposed message was. It came out as a film that was arguing against xenophobia, fear of the other, and also the Klaatu, the alien protagonist, in his arguments about nuclear proliferation and the arms race. That's very explicit.
I came here to give you these facts. But if you threaten to extend your violence, this Earth of yours will be reduced to a burned-out cinder.
He's a robot. Without you, what could he do?
There's no limit to what he could do. He could destroy the Earth.
What is very interesting, however, and it's not explicit, except it's the whole sort of resolution of the film. That was a period where early on, which in a certain way was leading to, was the Cold War, which was détente. It was threats from each side that had to be balanced so nobody pushed any buttons. And in a way, the alien coming and threatening to blow Earth up, unless people were peaceful and they had to be policed, was also a mode of détente. So even with its liberal politics, it was still arguing for détente, although that wasn't made so explicit as some of the actual explicit arguments in the film.
This is New York, as no man has ever seen it. Empty, deserted, its teeming millions gone. This is the setting for the most unusual picture ever filmed.
I know you're there! You're staring at me! No!
Most of the movie, they're wandering around a totally empty New York because there has been some horrible catastrophe, generally considered atomic, but it's like from radiation, and they all had a reason for being saved.
The most daring idea ever attempted in motion picture entertainment. The last 3 people alone in the world.
and Harry Belafonte, who's black, and this was a period certainly prior to the major civil rights movements. And it's very interesting because obviously the film was banned in some cases from being shown where there were issues about race and segregation, but primarily the film was a sort of plea for peace. The other interesting thing here is this kind of imagination of the cities without people, which is this haunting kind of, you get it in I Am Legend, I mean, originally in The Last Man on Earth, but you get it in The World, the Flesh, and the Devil. It's there in the kind of denouement of on the beach, cities with empty to people, like our monuments, our gravestones.
You can look at this entire genre of the post-apocalyptic disaster or crisis or survival film, whatever you want to call it, and there is a big tradition in American cinema of this. I think there is something in all people, and maybe especially in Americans, the belief that they could survive under any kind of circumstance. You could go back to Westerns or war films, and there's an idea that we have what it takes to survive under any circumstances, especially an individual. Or Last Man on Earth, the character's really struggling with the idea of whether he should continue or not. Why keep going? I think that's a question he asks himself every day.
The 60s were such a schizophrenic time for in a lot of different ways, but the two things that I remember about it were there was this overwhelming sense of dread, gloom and doom, the world was doomed, things were falling apart, Vietnam War, chaos in the streets, everybody on drugs, civil rights riots. On the other hand, we were going to the moon. Jacques Cousteau was exploring the oceans. The wonders of the ocean and of the universe were being opened up to us. And there was this sense of infinite possibility at the same time. So you were kind of going both directions at once. And the science fiction reflects that, from the darkest to the brightest and most hopeful.
If the 50s were about the fear of communism and the atomic bomb, you look at the 70s, and ecology suddenly raises its head. Environmentalism. You have Soylent Green, where, hey, Soylent Green is people. Most of the film, you're looking at a mise en scène, which is crowded and dark and sort of not space-driven, but ground-driven, that looks like, quite literally, a concentration camp of people. There's no sense of anything other. And things like a tomato or a stalk of celery become special effects in the film, as they're isolated as these incredible things that people don't have anymore. So food, crowding, old age becomes an issue, and the problems are very domestic problems of the time that emerge from a lot of the dialogues and arguments started in the 1960s with, the change in culture actually across a lot of the world in student protests and the rise of feminism and environmental concerns and so on. That continued into the 70s with a sort of trashed earth, which I think, interestingly, from the Mad Max films on, it's not just apocalypse, but it is a trashed earth. And again, the way environmentalism starts to creep in, is interesting because in the 70s, it's when it first starts. So that's there. The earth is not just decimated, it's trashed.
In the future, cities will become deserts. Roads will become battlefields. And the hope of mankind will appear as a stranger.
You want to get out of here? You talk to me.
The second invasion of the Body Snatchers was, I think, very interesting. Not only because it was dealing with, the fear of AIDS, but the very notion of somehow something invasive that you couldn't see was so much a part of the atmosphere of that film. I think that was one of the things that made it so interesting.
It's got no detail, no character. It's unformed.
All of a sudden, they're growing like parasites. Is it contagious? People are being duplicated.
Well, the first movie was one that I had seen during the 50s and was, as everyone else was, very moved by it, very scared. I thought it was a little masterpiece. I didn't want to do a remake of it, but to do a variation on the theme being that we're always in danger of becoming pods, that we're always in danger of losing our humanity.
How do you know my name? I didn't tell you my name.
Can't find anything in here that looks like a body.
One side's nosebleed.
It looked right at me.
You're looking at it as if it was human. It was not human.
At the beginning of the film, there's a sequence which, unfortunately, the studio made me put credits over, but pods are everywhere. But it shows a planet that has been devastated, that's only rocks. Every organic thing is gone. It could be that this is where our planet is headed.
They come from a dying world. They drift through the universe, pushed on by the solar winds. They adapt, and they survive. The function of all life is survival. Sleep.
I think I spent $10 in getting these little pieces of gel from an art store and finding a way to make them appear to be floating through the universe and arriving in San Francisco. It's a movie about organic invasion. I mean, we're having swine flu epidemics. We're having all kinds of strange epidemics popping up. We're having, AIDS, things that we never could have anticipated, particularly back in that period of time.
Sleep. Sleep. From deep space, sleep. The seed is planted. Sleep. Sleep. Terror grows.
Matthew!
Like the others.
Elizabeth, wake up! Get you when you sleep. Sit up!
Paranoia is a good thing. It's an ancient warning to be awake, to be aware of things.
When is it most powerful? When is a genre most powerful? Because you get waning and blooming second ages of the popularity of the science fiction film, first in the 50s, and then there's a period, it's not that there weren't any, but for the longest time, until really the 80s was the second big period.
Star Wars came along and basically rebooted the whole system. It was a reinitialization of science fiction in popular culture. All of those kind of Pandoran demons were swept away, and it was just cool. It was just fun. It was just exciting. It was just energy, excitement. Went back to the mythic archetypes, the sword-carrying hero, almost a samurai ethic, all that sort of thing. But it was, all of a sudden, science fiction was completely different.
That boy is our last hope.
No, there is another.
The Force will be with you, always.
I grew up in the era of, Earth versus Flying Saucers. I love that movie. And to me, that's the classic. It's also the classic in War of the Worlds, peace, and they toast them. So I grew up under the media influence, of movie influence, I guess, of, the monsters from outer space, and you don't ever trust a stranger kind of thing. And I was very happy to see Steve take the other route in Close Encounters, which is to say, they might just be nice. What about that?
And the first time I saw Jupiter, and the first time I actually was able to perceive the slight hazy rings of Saturn, I didn't imagine being attacked by those wonders of the universe. For me, it was a journey into discovery. I didn't feel anxious. I didn't feel a threat from up there. I always looked up at the sky and just saw all sorts of wonders of the known world. And so, to me, it was inconceivable that if I did get into science fiction someday, my first movie would be aggressive.
And one of the interesting strains during that period, along with Paranoia, as well as Aliens Are Us, cuddly, cute, that's all about them teaching us how to be more human, which is interesting. We go through periods of guilt, too, that play guilt about empire, guilt about race, guilt about our xenophobia, which, again, not explicit, but played out by these plots. But one of the most interesting things was, this was a period of pretty explicit feminism in the 80s, and a number of the films had protagonists or were dealing with plots which were, in a sense, trying to resolve the issue of what it was to be a male after feminism. So in many of these films, Brother from Another Planet, Starman, E.T., actually, they all sort of construct single-parent families by the end. I mean, the male comes, impregnates the woman, or, the female, or comes and is a father, but he's really left his kids somewhere else. But they have to leave. Terminator, drop into the screen naked. No male baggage, no cultural baggage for these characters. They stay, they're loving, or they save the day, but they can't stick around. But they're out there somewhere. But it was a very interesting bunch of films that were, in many ways, ended up with mom, single mom, head of household.
Sarah Connor?
Yes.
Sarah Connor, 35, brutally shot to death in her home.
You're dead, honey.
The two films that really brought science fiction into academia as an industry was Blade Runner and Alien. And the Alien films were certainly picked up by feminist scholars, worried over in all sorts of articles and discussions and so forth. So those two films made a big impression on the academic scholars. And in a sense, those were the films that made science fiction film respectable to the Academy. I mean, I had started long ago, but, at that point, people, would raise their eyebrows.
Alien, Ridley Scott's movie, scared me more than The Exorcist scared me. I don't think I've ever been as frightened, and I mean this, by any motion picture as much as I was frightened by Alien. It takes you to the brink of wanting to absolutely watch the picture from the, from the doorway into the lobby. And I was a captured audience because I saw that movie at the Motion Picture Academy, and I was right in the center aisle. I had a great seat, and I wish I didn't have a great seat. I wish I was on the aisle by the back door.
You're taking someone who's enters into a situation, realizes that there are overwhelming odds against them, but they know that unless they do something about those negative circumstances coming in, society will be destroyed. So do they take that challenge or do they not? And in the heroic structure, they do. You could look at a story like Shane or Rio Bravo. It's the same way as a Western hero or Luke Skywalker in Star Wars saying, I'm going to do this. I'm not going to just sit back. I'm not going to let this happen. I'm going to stand up and fight. Maybe that too is a very American concept in some ways, because it's based in our culture, from the origins of the country, of the revolution itself. But also, we like to embrace the idea of standing up against oppression. Whether it's a Frank Capra story with Jimmy Stewart, whatever that type of story, there is something about an idealized version of the American character that believes we do stand up for what's right and will go out and fight. So if you take that in a science fiction sense, whether it's Alien, Star Wars, or I Am Legend, you have this one individual who is willing to stand up and go out and do the really scary thing. Do the thing that is going to put their life in peril so that hopefully others may survive.
It's a meteor shower.
This new one you're tracking, how big?
It's what we call a global killer. Nothing would survive, not even bacteria.
The United States government just asked us to save the world. Anybody want to say no?
You think we'll get hazard pay out of this?
A lot of these films, genre films, but it, use Joseph Campbell and the myth of the hero and the journey and all the side characters that go along. It goes back also to Vladimir Propp and his notion of the folktale and the structure of the folktale and the way you can put all these things in combination. Basically looking anthropologically across any number of cultures is why they've sometimes been tossed off as nothing important. Is they reduce things, in terms of structure, plot structure, to some of the simplest elements ever, which then can appeal cross-culturally. You get a group of people together, and they become a microcosm of culture, of society, of the society in question. And in the war movie, it was very explicit. You'd get a black, you'd get a Jew, you'd get, the coward, you'd get the hero. I mean, these character types were just totally marked out. And you always knew who was going to die first, or who would, end up, because they had their functions in the drama.
A historic and unprecedented event has occurred. The question of whether or not we are alone in the universe has been answered.
Being exterminated.
In almost all cases, the alien is shown to be superior in intelligence and in technology, for the most part, as well, from the humankind. But the aliens have also been, figured as soulless or unemotional or bugs. Starship Troopers, yes. That was on the edge of parody, that film, and had a sort of very fascist sort of aesthetic. But nonetheless, their equipment was superior. There is this sense of, on one hand, one could also psychoanalytically suggest that we feel great guilt as a culture for our superiority, for our empire or previous empire building, for our behavior in parts of the rest of the world. I'm making this up, of course, because I don't think people go around purposely agonizing about it. But the guilt is you get payback. You have, in American culture, this sense our success won't last. We've done bad things in the world, and it's going to come back and bite us in the ass, And aliens are a good way to have that happen, if we don't do it ourselves.
Or it's psychological, it's the environment, it's the economy. I think there's always sort of a lot of free-flowing anxiety out there, and it's simply a matter of what you choose to tap into at any given moment. But that's kind of the role. It's the role that pop culture has always played.
I felt really at that time ahead of the curve, and I was totally upset when I told my friends. They said what are you doing next? I said doing a movie about global warming. And it sounded so unsexy in a way. And I said, no, I will do it my way.
I'm afraid that time has come and gone, my friend.
What can we do?
Save as many as you can.
Well, almost all American movies now have to be blockbuster movies. But there is a cathartic relation to seeing one's own, Susan Sontag says this, there's something about seeing one's own death on the screen. Here it's the death of the planet, or the death of civilization, or the death of human beings compared to zombies or whatever. And it's basically cathartic, even if you don't name it and make it explicit.
My name is Robert Neville. I'm a survivor living in New York City. I haven't seen another person in 3 years.
That notion of the imagination of disaster certainly goes back to the Bible, back to mythology. It's just what form does it take at any given moment, and to what extent does it speak to the culture, that particular culture, that particular time.
In America, we have this sort of history of what's known as the Jeremiad, which is a something that is sort of a religious concept. And the early Puritans and Calvinists had this sort of way of getting up. Every Sunday you'd go to church and there'd be a big, sermon, and that sermon was effectively your movie for the week. Like that was your entertainment, and those sermons were often. There's a famous one called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and basically it was all about how we had transgressed. It's this very sort of Puritan Calvinist notion, and it was this idea that we've transgressed, we've sinned, and that somehow something really terrible was going to happen. And the strange thing is, people sort of reveled in that. There's this kind of perverse pleasure you get in thinking about how you're going to be punished, or that some terrible cataclysm is going to happen or something, and it's just something that really seems to connect specifically to the American, this sort of the American nature, which is this sort of sense of almost a pleasure, that you derive from this notion of the apocalypse. And it isn't something that you see that much in other cultures, and yet it's something that somehow has traveled very well. It's something that seemingly, even if it's something that comes from the American subconscious, it's something that's traveled all around the world and seems to sell very well no matter where you go.
I thought we'd have more time.
I think that is deeply rooted in our psyche, that we humans think one day there will be an end. Because when you look at the Bible or at older texts, they all have the apocalypse, they all have the end of days. It's very deeply rooted in us, that we're fascinated by it. The Americans feel they're this island, surrounded by a very hostile world. It's just strange, and I have the feeling, that. It's also how Americans, appear outside, to the people. They always say, well, at home it's the best.
If the Earth dies, you die. If you die, the Earth survives.
The original Day the Earth Stood Still was a propaganda movie, which is not to say that it's a bad film. I think there are a lot of great cinematic, great movies, such as the Battle of Algiers, etc., that are incredible movies that are propaganda movies. I don't think that, for instance, that the later version, the remake of that movie, was a propaganda movie in the sense that it's basically entertainment. It's pop culture. It's not something that's trying to put itself across. I mean, I don't think we were more sort of doing things the classic B-movie way, which is using popular anxiety as a way to make a movie, as opposed to trying to get across a message or trying to make a political change or anything like that.
I think to remake a film and even think about this moment, what are the concerns now? So that you could remake a film, but I mean, in some cases, you can't just bend it to a particular issue. I think the success of The Matrix, the issue of what's happening in our heads and our consciousness, who are we? What's real, what's not real? Just having seen Inception, for example, what's interesting about that film is there is no such thing as privacy anymore. And we use the term identity theft.
There's always something that people are afraid of. You can look at the current political climate in the country now, and communism is no longer the threat, but terrorism has replaced it.
I think that every single War of the Worlds movie, every iteration from the novel to the radio show to the first movie and to my film, have all been timed, I don't want to say perfectly, but they've been in response to anxious times. the fear of British colonialism and H.G. Wells, strong feelings against it inspired his book. Hitler running rampant over Hungary and Eastern Europe in 1938 inspired, I think, the country to be prepared to be really frightened by something as benign as a radio show that very artfully suggested aliens were actually coming down in a news broadcast and it wasn't just a radio play. And then with the threat of the Cold War and the threat of the Soviet Union in 1953, I think people were ready to be scared by that War of the Worlds. And I have to say that in the shadow of 9/11 and a whole new threat, which was inconceivable before 9/11, I think this War of the Worlds comes at a time which is a sort of cousin in its appropriate timing to the other iterations of War of the Worlds. I certainly would have made this War of the Worlds differently pre-9/11. Let me address this. I thought that the unknown was benign. Otherwise, I couldn't have ever written Close Encounters of a Third Kind or the story and directed E.T. I think after 9/11, I lost a little bit of my innocence, and I felt that maybe the unknown isn't so benign. And perhaps the unknown is something that we'll never be able to put our fingers on, and it's a threat to all of us. And I think the tectonic plates of, I think, my culture certainly shifted, after the World Trade Center bombings.
I want to know everything you know. This thing, this machine, it crawled out of the ground, started torturing everything, just killing everybody. What is it? Is it terrorists? This came from someplace else. What do you mean, like Europe? No, Robbie, not like Europe!
At the same time, whenever I watch the skies, which I do often with my kids, I continue, despite the bad aliens in my War of the Worlds, I continue to look up at the sky and I continue to see the hope of a very amazing future for all of us.